I first had the idea for doing the Good Book a very long time ago when I was studying normative systems of ethics, that is, those that give people advice and instruction and guidance about how to live well. And it was very quickly evident to me that in the tradition of thinking that stems from classical antiquity, the Greek tradition from Socrates onwards, with Socrates' great question, how should one live, as the central question for all our lives. And looking also at traditions of thought in the East as well, the Confucian tradition, for example, it struck me that there is an enormous treasury of insight and of inspiration and of consolation in the non-religious literatures of the world discussing ethical questions, just as there are in the religious traditions. And it seemed to me then that it would be very interesting indeed had a group of people or a person done to that literature what had been done to the documents that underlie the book that we call the Bible, the Christians call the Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament as Christians call it, and the New Testament. That is, to have operated on these texts, redacted them. This is a form of editing in which texts are interwoven, other texts are interpolated, changes are made, there are modifications and arrangements and organizations. Biblical scholarship has shown us a great deal about how the Bible emerged through a quite long-drawn process as the work of many hands. And I thought that if something like that were done to the texts of Aristotle and Seneca and Pliny and Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, all the way up to the dawn of copyright, and therefore including Spinoza and Hume and Pater, drawing also from the Eastern traditions, and that if one could collate and organize and weave together these texts, one might produce a book. And remember, of course, that for most of history there was very little literacy, and so books were of great significance. Indeed, in some traditions, even today, they're of such great significance that insults to a copy, for example, of the Quran, can be very inflammatory. And so books throughout history have been tremendously significant, especially to those traditions where very few people could access them, could read them. And so it seemed to me, what would it be like to try to make a book in that same way, which drew on that treasury of resource for understanding the human condition and suggestions and discussions about what it is to be human and to try to live a good life in this world of ours. And so several decades ago, I began to collect texts, and I began to work on them much in that light. And I modeled it quite deliberately on the King James Bible, the format of it, which is, of course, double column, chapter and verse. It's very familiar to us, which I think is a very successful way of presenting texts on these heightened and significant matters, because it invites people to look at just a few verses or a short chapter, reflect on them, perhaps discuss them, or if they wish to read something longer, because a dense mass of text on a page can be quite rebarbative, and it may not draw people in to read it. And I thought one of the reasons why the Bible has been so successful in the past is because how it presents itself. Of course, there would be claims about other reasons why it's successful, but that would certainly be one of them. And in the case of the King James Bible also, the great beauty of the language. And it's really striking, of course, that the makers of the King James Bible in the first decade of the 17th century quite consciously and deliberately used a language that even in their own day was archaic. It was 100 years out of date, partly because much of it was drawn from Tyndale a century beforehand, but also because they realized that this heightened tone, this Vedic language, would, because of the significance and the importance of what was being conveyed, would be more suitable to it. And because most of the material that I drew upon in making this book came from sources, from translations that were which first appeared in the past, I again followed the example of the King James Bible makers and used the language which is not the language of today. It's not the language of the Wire, East Baltimore. It's not the language of the London streets, but it stands somewhat apart from that. And then finally, almost all my academic colleagues are very cross that I didn't put footnotes in, and so that people could know who said what. You know, is this Seneca, and is that Hume, is this Spinoza? But I quite deliberately detached the texts from their sources so that people could just address them, the ideas and the insights. Al-Ghazali famously said, if you were being attacked by a ravening lion, would it matter to you whether the person who rescued you was a learned man or illiterate? And in just the same way, the idea that all wisdom and all truth belongs to everybody, not just to the person who said it, means that these insights should be a possession for everybody, and it doesn't really matter where they come from. So that's the sort of how and why of how I did it. And the intention is a sincere one in the sense that, of course, it's not intended as an attack on religion. In other places and other times I've said pretty blunt things about religion, and I'm not myself a religious person at all, and I'm sometimes campaign on the behalf of secular themes. But the interest for me is in humanism, which is an ethical outlook that is a kindly, a sincere, a generous, inclusive ethical outlook. And I wanted there to be a resource. Nobody needs, in my view, a book of this kind. You don't need to be told or to be helped what to think. Everybody can do it for themselves. But it can be of some use to go to these great rich resources of the past and to see what great people of the past thought about these things, and to use that in eventually taking responsibility for thinking and acting for oneself. The one and only injunction in the book is to think for oneself, to go beyond teachings and teachers, and to take responsibility for your life. So this isn't an attack on religion. Rowan knows that. I mean, we converge a lot, I think, on the general impulse that is that people should have good and successful lives. And where we differ is, I think, if it isn't obvious, then it will emerge.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity for a conversation about this. And I'm fascinated by what there is here and deeply impressed by its range. To put my own cards on the table straight away, I don't regard this as in competition with the book that I more regularly use, and which I'm not proposing as yet to discard. But two things I want to say by way of preliminary in order to get into this not the Spanish Inquisition mode. The first is just a word about that phrase that Jude quoted in her introduction, about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, which I've always taken to mean that wisdom starts not just by individual human pondering, but with some sense of being overwhelmed by reality, by truth, by love, and the fear that's talked about in Jewish and Christian scripture has rather more to do with that sense of being brought up short and overwhelmed than what we might call servile dread. And that leads me into the interesting fact you do begin in your Genesis with something of that, with something of a sense of being overwhelmed. And one of the phrases which most resonated with me quite early on, it's also quoted on the back cover, a part of nature that mirrors nature itself. This is humankind. And as a religious person, I find that to be one of the most fundamental mysteries about our existence, that there is an aspect of nature that mirrors itself, that somehow the apparently neutral processes of nature produce a self-understanding, a self-imaging. And what conclusions you draw from that we won't agree about, but I think there is that element in there which is not a million miles from the fear of the Lord. I wouldn't mind hearing you on that in a minute. But my other question is perhaps a bit sharper, and it's about the differences. The reason the Bible is the way it is, I think, is that it's the book of certain particular communities. There are people who can say, this is our book, this is our history, our story. And they say that not just out of exclusivism, out of pride and narrowness, but because of, at least in part, because of a hard-won sense that the way we have learned is in the conflict that has brought us where we are. I'm always intrigued by the fact that in the Bible there are arguments going on. It's not just a single divine monologue, far from it. The arguments with God that are there in the Bible are part of the whole fabric. And that's part of what makes it, as I say, the book of certain communities. Now, what I wonder is, whose story is this? And whether the answer to that is bound to be a slightly abstract universal story about humanity, or something more specific. And one of the bits where I scratched my head rather was in the wonderful and quite substantial sequence you give us from Herodotus, and the way in which you depict the conflict between Greece and Persia as an archetypal West-East confrontation. And I thought, is that projecting kind of timeless quality onto East-West confrontations? Is it about a sort of zone of enlightenment in the world and a zone of non-enlightenment? There are some people who would find that, I think, a bit problematic, especially as you do go further east to look for your sources. So, two thoughts there. One about what place wonder has in all this, and am I right in thinking that is, in important respects, where you begin? The other is about whose story, and about whether you sense there are any risks in this kind of timeless quality that you might give to the classical stories.
Yes, these are two very, very good points. And yes, indeed, the right place, I think, to start is indeed with the response that people have, that human intelligence has to this world that we occupy, which is extraordinary. It's beautiful, it's amazing, it's sometimes threatening. And out of the joint endeavor of human beings coping with nature, trying to herd the animals, grow the grain, understand more and more about how nature works, comes something of understanding of a relationship with nature. I mean, one thing I was very struck by, for example, with the Eskimos is how they thank the seal for giving its life that the Eskimos can eat. That sense of knowing and being deeply related to nature. And it seems to me that one of the greatest achievements of humankind, which is natural science, rests on this foundation of exhilaration, of real joy at finding out and discovering things about nature, understanding it. And we know when we leaf through a book of zoology or a book of botany, really how amazing the world is. This idea that the quest for knowledge of the world and of self-knowledge surely is the very beginning of the human story. And any attempt to try to understand human nature and the human condition must have as an important part of it this aspect of ourselves, this wonderful seeking intelligence that people have. And so my book of Genesis does indeed begin with the apple falling in Newton's garden, and hence the beginning of natural science. So a somewhat different trajectory. The Herodotus point, East and West, I do actually use the terms East and West there, and I'm conscious of what people will read into it. But much more importantly was the conflict between two mindsets. And in those times, the Eastern way of doing things, or the Persian way of doing things, with the great king whose authority was absolute, and the satraps who were his subordinates but had their own absolute power, the idea of a very rigid, hierarchical, very oppressive structure in which people were the possessions and the playthings of these absolute rulers. Very different from the pluralism and the diversity which has its roots in the Greek world. Of course, the Greeks had their slaves, and women had an awful position in their societies, and so we mustn't over-romanticize it. But the roots of a more diverse and a more, I think, humane, a more pluralistic outlook were there. And had Xerxes won, had the Persian invasion succeeded, and of course it's almost impossible to play this game of what if, but it might have been a very different world. If the whole world were ancient Persia today, we certainly wouldn't be having this conversation now. And so I wanted to position that as a conflict between two ways of seeing things, and two ways of looking. And today, in 2011, we may very well read this in the Huntington, clash of civilizations way. But in other times and in other places and other circumstances, it may be seen for what it is, really, a figurative way of describing these different different mindsets.
No, you have responded, I think, to my underlying anxiety, which is about the Huntington model, sort of making essential qualities to this or that civilization. And I'm glad, too, to hear you acknowledging the shadow side of ancient Greece, that this is not just, I don't know, an 18th century coffee house in fancy dress. This is not the Enlightenment in advance. There are slaves who are supporting this. There are women whose voices are not there. There are despots.
Absolutely.
Even if rather more local ones you might get on the other side of the world. But can I go back for a moment to nature and ask how what you've said relates to that very venerable and in many ways very controversial bit of the Christian theological tradition that talks about natural law as the ground of virtue?
My feeling about that is in application anyway to questions of morality and social organization, that this is a recognition of that there being rather general facts about people and about their relationship to the world, from which one very readily infers one's certain duties towards them. So, for example, we are capable of suffering. We're capable of feeling the cold. We need companionship and love. We need opportunities to express and to receive love. We are creative, clever monkeys, and we need to be able to have an opportunity to play and to make things. And if you were to look at something like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which I happen to think one of the great documents of human history, one of the great achievements of the human mind, even though people rather poo-poo it now and they think it's rather lame and vague and overgeneral. But nevertheless, that document, which tries to specify those respects in which space has to be opened around the individual to allow each individual man or woman to make a life that seems good to them, subject, of course, to their not harming others in the process. But that seems to me noble, and it seems to me to be derived from a sense of the minimum that's required for human flourishing. And the idea of there being something that the world just tells us, or that human beings and human nature just tell us about the basis of what's right and wrong, lies behind this idea of natural law, that there is something in the facts from which one can deduce the prescriptions that are... So we may very well agree that the is-ought distinction really fails here.
I think that the idea that there's something utterly non-negotiable about human dignity is, to my mind, basic to any ethics worth the name here. I guess that, to go back to my second point again, the religious tradition sees that as something learned and something in part taught. It's discovered in events, it's discovered in collisions, it's discovered in revelation for a believing person. And I come back to this timelessness question. You say that there are features of the world around us which will tell us, if you like, what's due to human beings. How soon does that argument end when you're up against those who simply do not see?
Well, of course, there have to be limits, there have to be standards, there has to be a negotiation about where the acceptable limits of behavior lie. And generally speaking, I think we're rather good at this. Let me make a very general background point, which is that I, sufficient of a Confucian really to think that human beings are fundamentally well disposed to one another, that this is a mere product of our being essentially social animals. We need one another, we need our communities and our bonds, and out of this arises the fact that every day in every urban community, everywhere in the world, there are millions of acts of kindness and cooperation and sympathy, and that is the majority experience of humankind. So the conflicts, the murders, the greed, the atrocities, the wars, these are something which, of course, lies within our nature. But when it's expressed and goes too far, it's an aberration, it's a distortion of what we are at our best. And therefore, we have this, constant process. All through history, we see it, of the more reflective people thinking and debating and discussing, just as we are now, about the nature of the good and about how we should try to organize ourselves so that each person has that opportunity to flourish. So, yes, we do need to draw lines in the sand, absolutely. But we also, I think, need to have some confidence in the possibility of good if given its head.
I suppose that what's in my mind is the extraordinary capacity of human beings for self-delusion, for lying to themselves. And maybe this is my Dostoevsky bit coming through, the element of the tragic, the element of the disastrous quality of lying to yourself, the addictive quality of lying to yourself. How does your account of wisdom help us with that?
Well, as you know, of course, there are views about self-delusion which could be applied
they do say,
in other ways. But I agree, and I mean, I found very striking in your discussion of Dostoevsky this point. Thomas Mann has a rather dramatic way of putting it about the dark stranger suddenly arriving in one's life and turning it upside down. And, you know, this again is a fact, the tragic, the terrible sense of grief and loss that we are all of us exposed to. We actually contract for it when we love somebody. One of us will die first, or one of us will leave first, and so there is going to be pain. And pain is part of the fabric of our human experience. But as such, it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for sympathy with others who experience that pain. It's an opportunity to, when we recognize other people experiencing what we've done, or what we have experienced in the past, to support them and to reach out to them and so on. So, as is always the case, difficulties are also opportunities. They're opportunities for moral growth as well. But, of course, they're not only that. I mean, this argument could be transposed to the usual argument about why God allows tsunamis to happen and so on. In the end, the great Stoic principle of courage in the face of life is necessary here. The truth is, we will suffer, we will grieve, we will lose, and we have to bear that with all the dignity and all the courage that we can. And I think that is a marvelously noble and powerful attitude, which was for more than 500 years the outlook of the educated Hellenic.
Stoicism is very important in your understanding, obviously. And Stoicism not just as an attitude to suffering or stress, but also, because of what the Stoics originally thought, something to do with what they called attunement to things.
Yes.
Which is where the bridge to Confucius.
Yes, indeed. And indeed, it's a very interesting point, that, because one thing I found working on these traditions from which I drew was the convergence there, the great amount of agreement between what you might think, you know, spectacularly different cultural and ethical traditions, but a great deal of agreement between them. This idea that what one's adjustment to the world, one's orientation towards it, ought to be one which is, you know, which resonates very much with how it is with other people, but not in the sense of the golden rule in its positive form, do unto others as you haven't done unto you, because of the George Bernard Shaw point, you know, don't do unto others as you haven't done to you, they may not like it. And it's a very good insight, that one, because, of course, people are different, very diverse, and you have to see the difference, respect it, understand it, tolerate it, which is a hard thing to do. Tolerance is a really tough thing to do when you don't like what other people think or do. And all that work, the work of the good life and the work of the good relationship with other people, is in itself what it is to be living a good life. And they all agree on this. They all converge. But the particular point there about the attunement, the Buddha, Gautama, who instructed his pupils not to be disciples, not to turn him into a god, and so on. And, you know, I'm afraid the sort of Monty Python result ensued. But his attitude was one of compassion and of love, of a really tender kind of pity, not just to his fellow humans because of the capacity that they had for suffering, but to the whole of nature. I think it's absolutely wonderful, which is why his inclusion of animals, and I speak as a vegetarian, by the way. So, I mean, I think that is a marvelous attitude to the world.
Confucians and Stoics are almost the sages from central casting. You know, these are the people we tend to think of. Mm-hmm. If I were coming at it from one particular bit of my own tradition, I might ask about the prophetic strain in the Judeo-Christian world and say, What about the anger and the risk? How does that come into wisdom or virtue? Aren't Stoics and Confucians a bit too calm for comfort?
Well, Aristotle said righteous anger at the right time, in the right degree, over the right reason, is a virtue. And part of the virtuous life is not to... well, in fact, it's quite interesting that people in the Christian tradition are instructed to turn the other cheek and to accept the persecution, and indeed to rejoice in it if they do it in the name of their faith. Whereas Aristotle, who has said to people, look, our great feature is reason, so we must think our way through. Everything must be judged on the merits of the case. How you act in a certain case very much turns on what the facts are, and you've got to think your way through and do the right thing in that case. And sometimes the right thing is to be angry, and is to stand up against something and fight against it. And I think, you look, I go to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and I see NGOs working on putting to the council some terrible stories, some great sufferings that people have. And their anger is an Aristotelian anger. Of course, it's well organized and well disciplined, and they've got their facts and they do it well. It's not the anger of the riot. But yes, anger is appropriate.
I'll stay with that for a moment, because that really interests me. I think there is a very popular and prevalent idea that somehow anger is utterly inappropriate for the Christian or the religious person generally. And in fact, if you look both at Scripture and at some of the early Christian world, there's a very interesting kind of diagnosis of where anger comes in as an appropriate motivation, an appropriate response. Not only the phrase in the New Testament, be angry but do not sin, but also in the way in which in the 4th century some of the monastic writers say, of course you'll feel angry. Point is, what are you going to do with it? Against what is it directed? Is it directed outside? Is it directed inside? Is it directed at what destroys and dissolves humanity? Or is it directed against somebody who's, if you like, carrying the can for everything that makes you feel uncomfortable? So there is an interesting history there of a sort of diagnostic. But that leads me on to a question about, well, put it simply, educating the passions, educating the emotions. I sometimes feel, this is to broaden the discussion a bit, that one of the problems we face as a culture at the moment is we've been so busy reacting against repressed emotion that we've forgotten what it might be like to educate emotion.
Oh, I agree with you, absolutely. And indeed, this is a theme which you see in people I think of as late Stoics, people like Hume, for example, who very much insist on this idea of the educated, tutored passions, emotions. In his case, of course, because he thought that our motivation for action would always have to be an emotion, so it had better be a well-disciplined and informed one. And I couldn't agree with you more. And this touches on a point which is of the greatest significance, really. If I'm allowed to use the word in a sort of a non-religious sense to denote the sort of complex of our emotions and attitudes, if I could use the word our spirit or spiritual side of our life...
I think I might allow you.
to do that, then I think that is the most important part of us. And it's the part of us which has that need to love and be loved and to respond to beauty and to think of the world as a great unity to which we owe something, we owe a duty of care, and from which we draw all our nourishment in all respects. Now that is a non-rational side of us, although our rationality, our knowledge, our learning, our study, our inquiry, our science will inform and enrich it tremendously. But in the end, it lies deep in our emotions. And it's therefore of the greatest importance that we should cultivate them, that we should know how to feel in ways that are genuinely appropriate to their objects. It's like, learning how to love your children or love your spouse or love your fellows well. Not to love them jealously, not to love them suffocatingly, but to love them well. Now, this is a result of the education of the emotion. So I agree with you there. I think that's central.
There's a lovely phrase that St. Augustine uses, that we have to learn to love others humanly. Because he says we're constantly investing others with pseudo-divinity, whereas we need to love them in the complexity and limitedness of their actual humanity. But if it's true that we do live in this kind of society, and if it's also true, as I think we'd agree, that at the moment there's a much deeper interest in how we recover ideas of virtue than we've had for quite a while, what are the triggers, or where's the leverage that would help us culturally, educationally, in moving that forward? How does this book translate into early years learning, into the communities that live around us in South London? Where do we start? It's an unfair question in a way, because we're not running educational systems, we're not dictating those things, but where might it start?
Well, in lots of different ways, we're always at work trying to educate in this way. We do it in the family, for example, talking to our children. Every effort which is made from religious education classes right the way across to civics classes in other settings will touch upon these things. Society is a self-correcting, self-organizing, complex institution, and there are lots of different ways in which we discuss and examine these issues. And perhaps our best and richest way, of course, is through the narrative arts, through cinema and theatre, through novels, through our responsive and reflective reading on these things. That's our best educator.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because it did seem to me that sitting here, as we are in the South Bank, and after Jude's introduction, and Jude is beginning to make her way back to the stage, it's a very apt point to open up on, because I would agree very much that what we need for a renewed, a revitalized social discourse about virtue is a really alive, really creative culture of narrative art and the life of the imagination, because we're always being asked to reimagine who we are.
Well, I think, and Jude, I hope would very much agree, that we have, in fact, almost an embarrassment of riches in this respect in London, certainly. I mean, it's one of the great cultural capitals of the world. And the point that you make there merits the addition of the further point that what we want people to do is not only to enjoy this luxury of supply, but to know how to reflect on it and discuss it and to get something from it, not merely to sit passively and absorb, but to respond.
Well, thank you, both of you, for such a stimulating and provocative and profound evening. I think you've both been talking about love. I can't imagine setting about to write a book over decades, as you described it, unless you loved your fellow human and wanted, as you said, to offer something. It's for other people to receive it in whatever way they will. And you mentioned, both of you, that a place of this nature, a place like the South Bank Centre, is a place where people can congregate. We are a congregation of strangers brought together to discuss something together. And that's an act that I think culture really can offer in circumstances where we might not all share the same faith, except the faith in the possibility that we'd all like to be better, gooder, and happier. Can I thank you both so much for a great evening?